been gone for 3 weeks, and my journey in El Salvador, among many of the blessings, is I feel like a new way to see faith, hope, and humility. So those of you that might not be familiar, El Salvador is a small country in Central America. It's about 10% the size of our state of Washington. Their population is 1 million less people. Their cities tend to be very dense. So the city I was in, San Salvador, roughly similar population to the region, the city area of Tacoma, much more condensed, more multifamily structures. It was a place that I saw full of rich beauty and also a lot of complexity. Each morning, actually I was a little bit anxious when I went there because I had been working really hard on walking and exercise, and I was like, how am I going to get my walks in? And it was a blessing because it was a 2-mile walk kind of gradually downhill to my school. Comfortable in the morning. In the afternoon, it was a 2-mile gradual uphill walk in the hot, muggy sun. But on those walks, I got to see life in community, and one of the things that I really appreciated there is how the community comes around those that are doing work. So a couple times a day, different vendors would come through the neighborhoods and the communities. A vendor for little unique pieces of bread that looked kind of like pretzel shaped. It was normal bread. And then somebody else a couple days later with more of a roll. El Salvadoran tortillas are about this big around and thick, and they're not used to make tacos. And what I saw is the community would prefer to have those connections with those people than the major supermarket that was down the road. And for me, it was a way of caring for and helping each other. I saw families in that. I saw kind of the music and rhythm of a busy city. If you think Seattle rush hour traffic is bad, now imagine that happening in a city. Pretty much 16 hours a day, just jammed up. There was times I walked faster than the bus on that 2-mile route, and I'm not a fast walker. So I spend my afternoons on most days out in the community walking, visiting cultural and historical sites, and finding those opportunities to practice my little broken Spanish. And for me, those walks actually became moments of prayer. One of the first places I visited was the kind of Central Historical Center. And for those that don't know, or maybe much of this, I posted snippets of this on my Facebook and Instagram with photos, but I only gave people one side of the image because I was in a place where social media is reviewed, opposing views are not widely accepted. That doesn't take away from what I saw. I just want to be clear now that I'm here that people were giving a specific lens. In that, though, I just saw a richness. And so I remember on one of the first days visiting the National Cathedral in the historic square with a grand park, and it's the place where Monsignor Saint Romero is buried, and hearing about his ministry and work. And it was the first place where I really heard about the complex history of violence and death in El Salvador. I mean, it's got a long history, but there was a major massacre and movement that happened in 1932 there. Indigenous people, the poor, were starting to push back those in power. And so if you see pictures of cities and farms in that area, you will see these grand-looking areas with a lot of what you would think are good-sized buildings. And this might be like, I would describe it's like going to Hoodsport, except it's in like farmland. Looks really lovely, but outside of that, you would see twice as many small little shacks all packed together. And that's where the workers, the impoverished, the indigenous, that's where they lived. And they farmed for the right to be there and received almost nothing. And so around that time, the coffee market, which was huge for them, dropped. And the people started saying, hey, we're not being treated as equals or fairly. And it unfolded into the government coming in with strong power. And they're not sure of the exact amount of people. Definitely tens of thousands of people were murdered. They think it could be up to 40,000 people. And it was done in such a way that they were looking at voter rolls. Those that they could see voted for certain parties were questioned and shot. Women, children, in city squares. That moment of violence is still present there today because it existed over the years, that fear, that uncertainty. It's clearly a part of that nation's soul and being. And if you guys are not aware, they had a major civil war going on there for about 20 or 30 years. Now, the popular story is that it began in the 1980s. It actually began prior to 1980. What happened significantly is 1980, the US government started providing them arms. And so it became more recognized. And for those that have an understanding of the world, you see one side with M16s, the other side with AK-47s. And for me, my priority is to care of the people, but you also start to see where the monetary and economic interests are coming from outside. The thing is that trauma, having civil war even up into the 90s, is still carried by people. In some ways, those sides, those thoughts still exist. Even though that pain and suffering is there, though, there was a rich, deep hope. And in that, tremendous resilience. For me, I was able to appreciate the warmth, the laughter, the kindness that I met. The people were very welcoming. One of my teachers, who I've been actually taking online classes with since June, I was able to spend time with on cultural visits. He lives in a place I would call equivalent to living in Matlock, outside of San Salvador. He has to commute 2 hours by bus into the big city because he can't afford to be there. What I wasn't aware of until my trip is that my teacher, who just graduated his 5-year college program with his teaching license, was also a Catholic seminarian who spent 8 years in process and couldn't quite grasp Latin and Greek well enough to continue in that process. I say that because he is still a very deep, devout, faithful Catholic. And so when he shared with me that just a year ago, the government brought 4,000 soldiers and police into his small place the size of Matlock to scourge the hills, to weed out all the questionable people. Now, many of them have been simply labeled as gangsters, and were. But El Salvador is a place that casts a wide net. They cast a wide net to catch the bad. He said it was a terrifying experience to all of a sudden have several helicopters, military vehicles going through your town. All he could say at that moment was to pray for mercy and peace. See, I experienced a clean, safe town. There wasn't a lot of clear appearance of poor bothering people in the street. The crime rate there is ridiculously low. The murder rate in a 2-year period is the best pretty much of any country in the world. But it comes at a cost, a significant cost. For a country that's 10% the size of Washington State with 1 million less people, in 2 years they've put almost 90,000 people in prison. They have waived rights so that law enforcement, I think, has up to 6 months to determine what charges that they're going to charge people with. There's a group, Christo Seal, that the Episcopal Church has and a number of my colleagues support. that supports justice work. 2 of their attorneys in El Salvador have been arrested, and they are in prison now for 6 to 9 months for disturbing government processes. That was their charge. What they did was they went into court, filed legal briefs. They weren't waving banners. They weren't blocking doors. They were filing legal briefs highlighting that the country was not filing basic constitutional rights, and that they are actually putting some innocent people in jail. I say that because life is complicated. Things can be complicated. And our faith calls us to see things deeper than they are just on the surface. So what I saw in that place was a place where the poor were being pushed further from the city into small homes, small, simple places with an exterior that was just clad in corrugated steel. Many of the people I talked to that were teaching, that were supporting what I was doing, were people that had no vision or dream of owning cars, because those were things way outside of reach. When it got cold there, got down, I think there was one day it got down near 65. That was kind of chilly. They were really chilly. I thought it was finally a day of rest. They don't have heat in their homes. Some of them that can afford it might have, most people don't have air conditioning. When I was in Mexico, I thought the showers didn't work this summer in August because they were always about 90 degrees. And it wasn't until this trip that I learned that that's just what they do in Latin America. They don't have hot showers. And I learned just how different, because for them, when I talk to people, I thought, well, it's expensive to heat the water, and plus on most hot days, it feels really nice after being hot in the afternoon to come home and take a cool shower. And I'm thinking, here, it's like, wow, it's nice after a chilly day to go home and take a hot shower. We know what we know, and it takes work to know something different. So those things are beyond reach. It's a place where mental health care is something done by the weak and the broken. Because if you're strong, if you're mentally strong, you will just resolve to fix whatever you're going through. There, women's rights are fragile and often trampled upon. And yet, through all of this, people, they endure. They care for one another. They smile. They work. They sing. They gather at churches, markets, and classrooms. And I have rarely met such beautiful people. One of the days there, and I shared this in my social media, I visited the volcano Boquerón. This is a volcano that erupted hundreds of years ago, but think of it's only a couple miles from the city. So imagine Mount St. Helens happening right in the middle, between Shelton and Olympia. It basically cleared and scoured the landscape. But up there, on the outskirts, man's development, and the crater Ram Inn is a conservation area. This huge crater is filled with lush green plants growing out of volcanic rock. For me, it's really hard, other than the fact that we have St. Helens here, to picture what that destruction would have looked like. I'm blessed that I've been able to be places like St. Helens or the Big Island in Hawaii, where you can see these, or Eastern Washington and Oregon, where you have the massive lava fields. That's what that place looked like. And now it's lush, it's green. You see butterflies, flowers. You have the sounds of birds. It was a real powerful reminder for me of how God's work is present as creation is constantly renewing itself. Out of destruction, new life does emerge. Out of pain, the seeds of hope take root. It really, for me, was a story of the resurrection present in God's work in creation. And everywhere I went, I saw that same truth. In the National Library, I saw art that celebrated the country's creativity and courage. Though these statements weren't really popular in public forums or in the news, they existed in the museums, in the art, and the creativity of the people and the stories. There's a museum there of words and images. I saw needlepoint tapestries telling the stories of their Civil War through the 80s and into the early 90s. At a ancient Mayan city that's been covered from thousands of years in ash, Hoya de Sarén, in this ancient Mayan village, I saw how daily life continues even in today as their presence speaks across centuries. And for me, the moments even in parks where I saw children laughing in the rain, families sharing food, and one day even rescue workers hanging from ropes on rocks and running across, big, massive, it was, it was thousands of feet wide and they were going crosswise over it. I see life continuing with strength and in such a way that only grace can explain it. That was the strength and humility that came to my mind today as I was reading the gospel. Because Jesus is telling that story of two men who go to the temple to pray. The Pharisee there who was standing apart, and I don't know about you, but man, how often have I done this? I'm not one of those people. And that's exactly what that Pharisee was doing. And what Jesus highlights is the other, that tax collector, who even in his probably his own shame and guilt, which deeply saddens me because I know that God wants to see everyone, but doesn't feel worthy enough to lift his eyes to God. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. That is the faith that I saw day in and day out there. So while the Pharisee's prayer is polished and proud, it's all about himself, his good deeds, his place in the world, the great things he's done. And countries do this too. The tax collector's prayer is raw and honest. It's about God and the need for mercy. Jesus says it's the humble that goes home justified. That's what I think about when I have these pictures in my mind of the people I met in El Salvador. I hear the prayer of the tax collector. Their faith is not showy or proud. Some would tell you that it might not even be true Christian. I actually met some missionaries from the United States that are there to plant churches. By the way, there are many churches in San Salvador. Personally, I wonder if really white people need to be going down there opening churches. I think the churches down there need our support to do the work they're doing. Their faith is grounded in survival, in the basics, in their community, in simple gratitude. They do not boast about what they've done. They give thanks for what they've been given. They depend on one another. They depend upon God and God's blessing. And it's just important that we got to think about that temptation. That temptation of the Pharisee, it's just very human. It's going to keep popping itself up. We have to be willing to accept that it happens to us so that we can face it head on, that we can push and work against that. Because it's really easy for us to feel secure when we seem better off than someone else. It's easy to look at another country, another person, another thing, and say, I really know what I'm doing, and I don't know about them. The gospel reminds us that self-righteousness builds walls. It builds separation, and it's humility that opens hearts. Humility is not a weakness. It's a strength that is grounded in truth. I see it as a strength grounded in relationship. It allows us to see the world, to see others as God sees, to recognize the beauty and brokenness together. The people of El Salvador taught me that lesson in quiet, daily ways. They taught me that progress can only be measured not in comfort or safety, but in compassion and courage. Now for me, learning Spanish has been another source of humility. Now I've told folks throughout this journey that I've learned that this is a slow race. And like grace, languages and like grace, these things take time. You cannot rush understanding. You cannot quickly come to knowing things. For me, some days, words in Spanish come easily. It was surprisingly, to me, how easy last evening when I finally got home that some of my Spanish came forward. When I was in El Salvador on sub days, I tell you, I didn't want to speak any Spanish, especially after studying some verb forms. See, when we can step back, we can embrace those little small steps. Connect with moments of joy. Celebrate this work of the Spirit in our lives and in our communities. So our faith grows in that same way, little by little, through practice and patience. And in the church, we often talk about what does the church offer for us? How does the church transform people and change them? You know, we are not a place where somebody's going to come in and walk out the door tomorrow and be 100% a completely new person. I mean, in some ways, I feel like you can say spiritually, but I'm just going to say is, it really takes intentional work. It takes intentional trust in God. Not in such a way where we get all uptight and constipated about it. Now, constipated in Spanish, by the way, is a stuffy nose. So, sometimes we gotta let go of the wheel of the bus and trust that there's someone else driving. But be willing to see our part and our role in it. Jesus shows us that transformation begins with humility. Seeing ourselves in relationship, community, in the world, and also seeing ourselves as God sees us. So that tax collector's simple prayer, be merciful to me, opens the door to new life. We don't need to stand apart to prove ourselves right. We only need to stand before God with open hearts. That parable that invites us to live in humility does so not as shame, but as gratitude. To be humble is to be teachable, to be open to love, to let God's mercy shape our hearts and our inner selves. When we stop measuring ourselves against each other, we start noticing the presence of God in simple, ordinary things, including our own lives. We begin to see the kingdom that is breaking in around us. In the rain, in the laughter, in a shared meal. In prayer spoken with a trembling voice, God is there. The people of El Salvador live that truth every day. Their faith is not built on certainty or pride, but on trust that even out of ashes, life rises again. That same promise is for us too. Whether our prayers are fluent or faltering, whether our hearts are strong or weak, God meets us with mercy. Today, my prayer for each of us is that we can walk with the humility of the tax collector, that we can see each other not through the lens of comparison, but with compassion, and that we can remember that grace comes not when we have it all together, but when we stand honestly before our God and one another, saying, "Be merciful to me." Because in that prayer, we find freedom. In that humility, we find joy. And in that mercy, we experience that God's kingdom is already among us. Amen.
Amen.